Right, there we go. If I could ask, while Giles, and hopefully when Paul manages to join us while they're speaking, if you can keep your audio turned off, if you can keep your mics turned off so that we don't interrupt the speakers as they're trying to speak, and we don't get interrupted by the Amazon driver turning up at your front door to drop off your latest purchases for Christmas. The way we'll be running it is that we'll have our two speakers. Giles, and as I said, hopefully Paul will join us. And if while they're speaking, if you have any questions that occur to you while you're listening to what they're talking about, if you can post those questions in the chat, then we can deal with those afterwards. And then once they've finished speaking, we'll open it up to a more general question and answer session and discussion of what's been said. As I said, this will be posted on our YouTube channel afterwards, so you can revisit it. So I'm very delighted this evening to be able to welcome two very senior members of the police and enforcement community in Norfolk. We have Giles Orpen-Smellie, our police and crime commissioner, who many of you will have met in other fora. And hopefully in the fullness of time, if Paul can get his technical issues sorted out, we'll also be joined by Paul Sanford, a more recent chief constable at Norfolk Constabulary. Anyway, so you don't want to hear me talking, so I'll now pass over to Giles, who is our first speaker this evening. Over to you, Giles.
Paul, thank you. Good evening, everyone. I was going to do a very brief introduction and let Paul give a sort of an operational update, but what I'll do is I'll launch into a longer spiel. Hopefully I won't make too many operational errors, and that will offer Paul the opportunity to join. And equally, if he can't, hopefully we'll cover the ground. The real value of this evening is not me talking at you, but actually me listening to your questions. So I'm very keen to do a scene setter to prompt questions. I'm conscious that you all represent constituents. They're my constituents as well as your constituents, and I hope you've got questions that you will be bringing from your constituents. I very much hope you'll be able to report back to your constituents on what you've heard. Particularly when we get on to more difficult questions like the annual precept setting round that we're in at the moment. So where are we in terms of policing in Norfolk? Well, in general terms, I would suggest that we're in a good place. Norfolk is a safe county. We're very far down the list of statistics for all the major sorts of crimes that tend to worry most people. There are one or two exceptions. Sadly, rape and serious sexual assault is increasing, and violent crime is tending to increase. The former seems to be a reflection of the dysfunctional society we live in, and the latter probably is related as much to the nighttime economy as anything else, as that comes back to life post the great pandemic. I've touched in the past on what I call the expectation gap, which is the public's desire to see old-fashioned policing. I sometimes rudely refer to it as Dixon of Dock Green policing. You know, one or two officers on the beat in the old-fashioned way, wearing helmets, tunics and ties, rather than the sort of the RoboCop stab vests and all the other bits and pieces. A couple of medal ribbons on the chest would be nice, and so on. And comparing and contrasting that with the fact that the public tend not to see that because the police are doing their core business, which is tackling crime. And I'll touch on some of that in a moment. One of the problems, though, as an aside, is that somewhere around 60% of all the calls that come into the police control room are actually not crime related at all. You know, over 20% of the calls that come into the control room are related to mental health. The police might be the first responder, but actually it's not their burden, really. They take it on for others. And, you know, managing that demand is one of the challenges, and I'll touch a little bit more of that on that in due course. But there is this expectation gap between the demand on the constabulary and the public's desire to see officers on routine beat patrolling. So let me touch a little bit more on that demand. The first duty that the constabulary has is to protect life. And if I just sort of run through the top 4 from a policing perspective, risks to life, you'll get a feel for why we have this expectation gap. At the top is mental health. And I'm not now talking about people who kick off in the middle of a shopping centre or whatever. I'm talking about the tragic numbers of suicides. I think last calendar year it was about 118. It was certainly over 100 suicides. And of course, the Constabulary respond to those. And there are many more that the Constabulary respond to who they're able to successfully talk down the person. But the question then is, what happens to those people once they've been talked down, or of course, once the tragedy has occurred, how much effort the police have to then put into dealing with those situations and distraught relatives and all the rest of it. The second challenge, the second risk to life are drugs. And I'm not now referring to the criminal problem of drug supply, but the tragedy that arises from drug overdoses. In recent years, we've lost over 70 a year to drug overdoses. Last year, the figure came down to 50. We're waiting to see whether that's a reflection of the Constabulary's hard work and the hard work of people working in partnership with the Constabulary, or whether that's just a downward dip, which will be corrected as we disappear from COVID. But this year, the last year, we got it down to about 50, which is good news. But of course, each of those is something that police have to get involved in. The next one coming down the list are our roads. And I know many of you are concerned about speeding through villages. I think last calendar year, we lost 39 people on our roads, but more significantly, there were well over 400 seriously injured. Seriously injured, not just injured. We would have lost more, but for the quality of engineering of our cars and the quality of our trauma staffs in our A&E departments. But again, each of those road traffic accidents is something that the Constabulary has to address. And it's only when we come down to the fourth that we really enter the real sort of world of policing, and that is homicide. I use the police term of homicide, which sounds a bit American, but the view is that it's not a murder until it's proved to be such in a court of law. Last year, there were 9 homicides. One was probably drugs and gangs related. 3 were mental health, where people in mental health crises killed family members or their carers. 5 were domestic abuse incidents, or were probably domestic abuse incidents. I can't say that for certain in every case. But where you're getting to with that is actually the risk to life from criminal means is actually very low. For most people in this county, the greatest risk to life is on the roads. And I think we're all familiar with that idea. But I touched on domestic abuse, and I think that does take us off into the sort of the wider criminal scene. The highest volume of crimes that the Constabulary deal with is domestic abuse. 24% of all reported crime is related to domestic abuse in the county, which is an extraordinary reflection on our society. I've touched on the fact that 20% of calls to the Constabulary are related to other mental health issues. And I'm not now talking purely about suicides, but the call that comes into the control room about someone kicking in doors or windows, which when the officers respond, turns out to be somebody in the middle of a mental health crisis. And the issue there is that given the state of the county's mental health services, the Constabulary may have to take someone to A&E, and they'll end up waiting just as long as anybody else in A&E. We did some statistics up in Yarmouth, and it's normally 90-minute wait on the roadside for an ambulance. And once the ambulance announces it's not coming, I think it was a 12.5-hour wait in A&E. And of course, that's 2 officers sitting in A&E with a patient, 2 officers who are not back out on the beat. And then you go to things like the nighttime economy and so on down the way. Now, you'll notice in that sort of list, I'm not really touching on very traditional things like burglary. Norfolk has the 2nd lowest burglary rate in the country. One of the things that you will have noticed, reading the Eastern Daily Press and listening to some of the other media, is that Constabulary get a lot of criticism for the low prosecution rate of those crimes that we do have. The national average for prosecution at the moment is 7% of all reported crime. And that sounds as though we're not doing very well. Norfolk was complimented in our inspection report, which is a very good report, but we were complimented for having a prosecution rate that's 2% above the national average, i.e. 9%. And that might suggest that 91% of crimes are not prosecuted. That is an unfortunate byproduct of unhelpful Home Office reporting rules. So if an officer attends a domestic abuse incident, he might record 5 separate crimes because they have to record every sort of crime that they find going on. But the Crown Prosecution Service, when they look into it, might only pursue one of those crimes as a charge. That doesn't mean that 80% of crimes are not followed up. It just means that only one of the 5 crimes that was ongoing in that one criminal incident has been taken forward. But you can see how that distorts the sort of the statistics and gives the impression that we're not pursuing crimes, which is far from the case. In the spirit of keeping moving forward, because I obviously could dwell on this forever. You know, we could still be here at breakfast time if you really let me have my head. But I'll move swiftly on to some of the challenges. The first of which I've touched on, it's demand. 60% of calls to the control room are not crime related. There are, at this time of year, we're dealing with about 300 999 calls, about 750 to 1,000 101 calls. That's an increase. Before the pandemic, the Constabulary would expect to deal with about 250 999 calls in a 24-hour period. And only at New Year's Eve, the 24 hours over New Year, would they expect to approach, let alone go through, the threshold of about 500 999 calls. But if I tell you between the May and the August bank holiday this year, because of the increased numbers of visitors we had to the county, they were regularly approaching, if not going through, the 500 999 calls in a 24-hour period. And 101 calls were going up into sort of the 1250 mark. So the demand on the Constabulary is significantly greater than they have resources to meet. We have 1,800 officers, but in order to maintain a 24/7/52 service, there are only about 200, 250 officers on duty. Once you take off the specialists, you're probably looking at about 100 officers available to respond to everything that's going on the ground. And we are the 5th largest county. And you can see that with somewhere between 300 and 500 999 calls, how an individual shift for 8 hours is going to be quite stretched. Going on next, I would look at the criminal justice system and go back to this question of prosecution, and particularly the timescale for getting prosecutions done. And again, the police are taking the blame for a lot of this, and that in part is because we run the victim care service. But the police are just the front end of a criminal justice system, and the criminal justice system is not the single system that its label suggests. If I sort of describe it as the police being organised on a county basis and being held accountable at county level by me, and I hold it to account on your behalf with some rigour, but then the rest of the criminal justice system is organised differently. The next bit of the criminal justice system is the Crown Prosecution Service. That's organised on a regional basis and is held accountable nationally by the Attorney General. The next bit is the Courts and Tribunal Service, which is an agency of the Ministry of Justice held accountable nationally by the triumvirate of the Lord Chancellor, the Lord Chief Justice, and the Senior President of Tribunals. And so it goes on through the magistracy, the judiciary, the probation, the prison service. And this results in a balkanised, dysfunctional system that is painfully slow. It's currently taking a good 18 months to get a charging decision on a serious sexual assault, and it might then take another 18 months to get into court. And of course, the next thing that happens is the defence barrister stands up and says to the poor victim who's having a hard time reliving that experience, you surely can't remember with any clarity what went on the best part of 3 years later. And you can see how how the problem compounds. One of the issues is that there is no one at county level to address local issues. If it comes up on the constabulary side, then people can get in touch with me and I can say to the Chief Constable, what are we doing about this? And simply by asking questions, we can accelerate the thing. But if we're asking questions to the Crown Prosecution Service, they'll refer it to London. And with the best will in the world, London isn't very interested in an issue being raised from a rural county. In other words, we have lost sight of victims. And sadly, I have to say that victims all too often are denied justice, either because they decide to withdraw or because the thing just goes so long that key witnesses withdraw, or it just becomes untenable to pursue the prosecution. And on the other side of the coin, perpetrators are escaping justice. And in some respects, that is even more worrying. I have great sympathy for the victims, but actually I'm even more worried about the victims who will not be avoided because we've locked up the perpetrator, because the perpetrator has escaped justice. Going on from there, I have to talk about resources and money. And of course, that leads me on to the decision I've got to make very shortly about whether there should be a rise in the police precept of council tax, and if so, by how much. The budget for this year is £197 million. Of that, 55% comes from the Treasury via the Home Office, and 45% of that is already provided by the households of Norfolk through the police precept. Of that money, 86%, so 169 million, goes on staff for the 1,800 officers I've mentioned and the 1,300 civilian staff. Those civilian staff are not sort of bureaucrats and cooks and bottle washers and whatever. They play a key role. As I say, Norfolk is the 5th largest county in England and Wales. If we can't keep our officers in cars on the road, then we can't provide a service. So we need vehicle fitters in our workshops. A lot of them are specialists at the other end of the spectrum. So police, forensic, digital investigators, or they work on more traditional forensics. And so it goes on. That only leaves then 28 million, 14% for everything else. So police stations, vehicles, equipment, training, specialist capabilities like forensics and so on. Now, at the moment, and I've got my final budget meeting next Monday, but I had a preliminary meeting with my team this morning. We're looking at carrying about £25 million of costs, absorbing those costs into the budget this year. Because with the indicative numbers, sorry, for next year, with the indicative numbers, that's the sort of figure we've got. For example, the police this year got a 5% pay rise. That was set at national level, but it has to be funded at local level. We got no money from the Treasury for that. 5% equals a £7 million hit on the budget. The Home Office found 1%, 1.5 million. I had to find the balance. I suspect next year I will have to find all of it. We will know in due course. And then if the police get another pay rise next year, I'll have to find the addition from the additional sums from in-house. Now, you'll immediately realise that the 28 million doesn't give me much scope. So the only way I can approach absorbing that money is by attacking either headcount, so cutting officers, cutting civilian staff, cutting activity, or cutting capability, none of which are palatable. If I put the precept up, in the current climate, with the cost of living spike being what it is, I will be struck off many Christmas card lists, and I get that. But the point is that if I put the precept up by £10, that brings in £3,040,000, which in the current climate would be extremely useful to keep officers on the road. I might add that next year my budget goes up to £202 million. That's a £5 million uplift, but the government has already assumed that £3 million of that £5 million will be me putting up the precept by £10. In January, I'll be going out to consultation. There'll be an online survey. There'll be paper versions as well. And I'm really keen that as many people from across the county express a view. So as elected representatives in your respective areas, I hope you'll encourage people to keep an eye out for that and express a view. I hope they will recognise that despite the cost of living and all the rest of it, we do need to pay for a police force because we do need to stay safe. And sadly, crime inevitably will increase in the cost of living spike. But if there is a different view, that at least gives me ammunition to take to ministers and say to government, we need to do better. But I can assure you that there is no mood music in the government to increase police budgets significantly. Their view is that they have put £1 billion into policing through the uplift in police officer numbers, the 20,000. My response to ministers is that that's great, it's very welcome, but 20,000 officers, our share is 224, is not the whole answer. There is a wider and more complex question. Sadly, I don't think the Home Office necessarily understands that fully, even though they're willing, but the Treasury certainly doesn't understand that. So we are slightly pushing water uphill over a sieve, but I keep bashing away. I've rambled on a bit, and I think probably that's enough from me at this stage. So let me draw a line. I'm not sure if Paul got in. I haven't been paying attention to my screen, but
yeah, and I can confirm Paul is in. I can see Paul sitting in his office, and
fantastic.
All the icons on the screen indicate to me that he's now available and ready to go. So
perfect. Well, he will have heard what I've said, so he'll now come in and may well wish to either add to it or indeed correct it. And very welcome to do so, Paul.
yeah, indeed. So it's over to you now, Paul.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. And sorry, I just had some technical issues joining, so I apologise that I was a bit late. But thank you for the invite this evening. I have indeed listened to everything that that the PCC has just been through, and I think he's given a very comprehensive overview of the challenges facing the constabulary. Probably not necessary for me to repeat them here. I think the best way I could use my time this evening would be to field any questions that you might have. If I may, though, I'll just focus on a couple of very quick issues, just to underline what I think are the biggest challenges facing the constabulary. I always say, as a chief, I've got three priorities. Number one is providing the services that the people of Norfolk need. That's about keeping people safe. That's about being responsive when people call us for help. And it's about catching criminals, locking them up and putting them behind bars and delivering justice. My assessment of where the constabulary is with that is that we're in a very strong position. The change and shape of crime is ebbing and flowing all of the time. As Giles alluded to, we're investigating more crime that happens behind closed doors than we are crime that occurs in the street. But nonetheless, I think the constabulary is in a good place and managing the very complex threats that come our way very well. The second challenge I have is people. That's ensuring that I've got a workforce that's highly trained, motivated, and critically at the moment has the right standards and the right values. And I know, and every police chief up and down the country knows, that there's been times in the past few years where policing has let itself down. Most of those that have been reported on have been elsewhere in the country, but the importance of high standards is, well, it's essential in every police force. As Giles alluded to earlier, our focus is on making sure that those standards are high. You do that by doing the basics well, making sure that officers are well briefed, well presented, well turned out, prompt and attentive. And a real focus of mine, and indeed my chief officer team, is to make sure those standards are where they need to be. It is quite possible, as we push those standards high, that we will find some officers, some members of police staff that aren't at the level that we would want. And when that happens, we will take action. What I would say to anyone that listens is, please judge us on the action that we're taking to root these people out of the service, as opposed to being critical when we find them. The police service that I joined now is so different, that I lead now is so different to the one I joined at the end of the 1990s. Our standards are undoubtedly higher. And when people cross the line, I'll be kicking them out. And that's the right thing to do. And I will continue to do that. So on the rare occasions that my officers don't meet the standards that we would want, you can expect that, and you will see the action that's taken. Having said all of that, conscious that it sounds a bit gloomy, every day the officers under my command provide exceptional services, carry out amazing acts of bravery, and carry out the most sensitive and diligent investigations. And I am proud to lead them. But it's because I have that pride in the service that we are so determined to remove those people that have no place in policing. And then finally, the third thing that always concerns me as a Chief Constable is money. It is third because it's not as important as the other two, but it's an enabler of the other two. I was very pleased when the the Inspectorate of Constabulary Fire and Rescue Service, HMI CFRS, reported on us in October this year. They rated us as outstanding for use of resources. That's how we use the money that is given to us by the taxpayer. They judge that we look after every penny carefully, and we will continue to do so. Over the last 10 years, we have driven out tens of £millions worth of savings from this constabulary, and we are continually on the lookout for more savings for two reasons: because I've got a deficit, but also because every penny that I do save, where I can, I will reinvest in frontline policing, where we will have the biggest effects in our communities. But that's becoming more and more difficult every year, and particularly difficult with the inflationary pressures that we are facing. Whether it be fuel, whether it be heating, whether it be the supply of services, it seems that everything that we procure at the moment is going up in price, and that is a challenge for us. But we are doing everything to look under every single stone to find any saving that we can make. But every year that we make savings, the task gets harder the following year. I continue to provide the PCC with a detailed briefing, or detailed briefings, on our budget and the steps that we are taking. And I can assure everyone that's listening that he scrutinises me very closely as to how I'm managing the constabulary's budgets. I think that's probably enough from me, Chair, and I'm more than happy to field any questions.
Right, thank you, Paul. So it's over to you all now. If you've got any questions, can I ask either you put your hand up virtually using the buttons at the bottom of the screen, or physically if you've got your camera on. I'll try and keep an eye out for anybody. I have been keeping an eye on the chat, and we have got one which we can kick off with. That's from Angela in Bishop Terrington. I'll ask the question, unless you particularly want to come in and ask it yourself, Angela.
Yeah, I could do. It's we're on the, me and my neighbours are on the outskirts of Terrington St John. We have equestrian properties. I live on my own. My neighbour is a family of 3 adults. On Saturday, they had their tractor stolen. Police attended. They've had scene of crime, lots of support. January, my quad bike was stolen. I need it for my equestrian activities. Nothing. 2 weeks ago, there was an attempt on my quad bike. Again, nothing, no support. I haven't seen anyone. I struggled to report it, but eventually reported it. And I feel very, very vulnerable and alone. And I'm now going out late at night in the dark, well, it's dark, doing late night checks, just to, you know, if I can actually catch them in the act, but I'm on my own. So I'm sort of feeling that women on their own are not getting supported, whereas families are. And I'm sure that's very, very unfair, but that's how I'm feeling at the moment.
I think that's probably one for you, Paul.
Yeah, yes, it is. Thank you. So, Angela, firstly, sorry to hear that you've had that experience as a victim of crime. Being a rural county, we do have challenges with agricultural thefts.
Yeah.
And there are certainly commodities out there, whether they be quad bikes, equestrian gear, that is attractive to criminals. There is no doubt about that. our work on these sorts of crimes is finding that much of this equipment is being exported abroad in containers and finding its way often out to Eastern Europe. And we are carrying out a number of operations with partner agencies at the borders, overseas police organisations, and indeed the National Crime Agency to try and get to the bottom of the markets that is leading to these thefts. We have a number of initiatives in place around rural crime, and much of that is targeted in your part of the county. That has been successful in reducing the volumes in recent years. One of the measures that we use around volume crime is the NFU Mutual's annual cost of crime report, which effectively is a measure of the number of claims made by the farming community predominantly for theft of agricultural plants and similar type machinery. And we have seen recent reductions bucking national trends in that area against that survey. But of course, I recognise that that's little comfort to someone like yourself when you've been a victim of crime. What I would do, Angela, I've just taken note of your name. I'll ask the officers that work in your area to carry out a review of the crimes that you've reported to us and perhaps make contact with you to talk about your particular details.
Thank you.
For the purposes of this evening, I would just say that we are doing our utmost to tackle this. We're trying to disrupt the markets. In terms of reducing the extent of the criminality, that is the most successful thing that we can do. We have had numerous disruptions in this area. Only this afternoon, I was looking at some activity that our ANPR teams, so these are officers with automatic number plate recognition software, our teams in the west of the county have had a remarkably successful fortnight seizing stolen plant equipment. So we are actively doing that and taking it off the road. But unique to your circumstances, I'll ask a local officer to make contact with you and see what reassurance we can put in place for you.
Thank you, because I'd just like some advice on what I can do to increase security, rather than throwing my money at sort of what I'm thinking might work and discovering it's not. We
will be in contact very shortly.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Paul, picking up that point generally, I mean, is there somewhere that people can go to get advice on how they can, I suppose, crime-proof their property or their properties?
So what I'd recommend to anyone on the call is if you were to go on our website, when you open our website, there's a map where you can click on your area or enter your postcode, and it will provide you with the details of your local policing team. In each of our neighbourhoods, we've got a designated, we call them beat manager, but effectively they're a neighbourhood officer, friendly community officer. Our website will provide you with their contact details, email address, phone number. Please bear in mind they work shifts, so they're not on all of the time. And they would be more than happy to come out and speak to anyone on an individual basis about those sorts of things. It doesn't require a call into 101. Just access it via our website. That's by far and away the best way.
Excellent, thanks. Right, we've got another question from Judy here, who's saying, do you think the demands on the police to respond to mental health issues is likely to decrease in the next 12 months?
Happy to take that one again. So I'm just working between Giles and I, but I'm happy to take that one. The short answer is no. Sadly, I don't, because the trend line is going up. It's gone up in each of the last 5 years. We are a national outlier when it comes to suicide. I heard the PCC make reference to the stats earlier on. So much of our demand is driven by mental health, and we the reality of the situation is we live in a county where we've got a foundation trust that has been rated inadequate by the CQC for its mental health provision. And that's a rating that has been awarded regularly over recent years. And my officers are seeing the consequence of that. We are spending far too long dealing with mental health incidents. Most importantly, that is not right for someone in mental health crisis. If I found myself in that terrible situation, I would not want a police officer knocking on my door. I'd want a trained mental health professional. But unfortunately, it's the police that are picking up the pieces of this. So my biggest concern with that is the impact on the individual suffering crisis. But there is no doubt, and the Inspectorate of Constabulary identified this in their reporting to us, the demands of mental health on policing are now getting in the way of our ability to fight crime. And I have met regularly with the Foundation Trust to raise these concerns. And I am now faced with the difficult decision of deciding whether actually the police service needs to stop deploying to such incidents as well. That is something that I think very carefully about pretty much every day, because they're difficult decisions. What we really need is an adequate mental health service to help pick up that demand, and at the moment it's not there.
Right.
Okay, thank you. Right, is there
Right.
anybody else? Right, Val, I can see you're in the middle of my screen with your hand up. I'd like to unmute and ask your question. Right, you need to unmute. You need to turn your mic on, Val.
So easy to forget that you muted yourself. Sorry about that.
Absolutely.
I'm just picking up on an aspect of what Angela was talking about, and about how, as a woman on her own, there doesn't seem to be an awareness of the specific needs and realities of women. And it kind of, it connects with some of the things that both Giles and Paul have talked about this evening. And Giles and I have talked about this at the Fakenham NAUC event a while back. And my concern is, if you aggregate the crimes for sexual assault and domestic abuse, they come out at the biggest number of crimes in Norfolk. Now, these crimes are directed specifically against women. And we know that the police force's reputation has taken the biggest hit I've ever known it to take in my lifetime because of the force's Norfolk, Met, everywhere. The force's inability to take sexual assault, rape, domestic abuse, and misogyny within its ranks to take it seriously. And I would love to hear from both you, Paul, and you, Giles, what are you doing about it? And just as an additional question to what are you doing about it, you recently got funding to take on more staff to address these issues. And I'm wondering, how many of those staff were women out of the full complement? Because as women know, we have to police our lives in terms of what we're able to do, and particularly in terms of going out at night. And as well as what happens to us in the home, in domestic situations. And I'm not sure that we can trust, as things stand at this point, with the lack of due attention that's been paid to dealing with these crimes against women, I'm not sure that we can trust men to actually take them seriously. So that's what I want to ask you both.
All right. Giles, do you want to go first?
I'm happy to go first. Val, good to see you again. And yes, we have had this conversation before. I think we need to be careful about how we put questions like this, because I totally get that there have been some horrible scenarios in which police officers have done terrible things, and I obviously am thinking about Wayne Couzens' despicable act and the tragedy of Sarah Couzens' death, and there have been a number of high-profile stories of similar ilk. But we're actually talking about a tiny proportion of police officers. The problem we face is that because of the media stories that are put out, every police officer everywhere gets tarnished by the conduct of a single police officer somewhere. And we just need to keep the whole debate in kilter. Now, I can assure Val and everybody else that since I arrived in May, which was relatively soon before the Sarah Everard tragedy, there has been a spotlight on this subject within Norfolk Constabulary. It features in the police and crime plan that I wrote, which was in effect a contract negotiation between myself and the Chief Constable. And I presented a police and crime plan that I was determined that the Chief Constable would accept and implement. And that's why it was a negotiation, because he had the ability to comment on it as it was being prepared. And I am clear that he gets the message. We have a government violence against women and girls, or VAWG strategy. There's an APCC strategy, there's an MPCC strategy, and there's a constabulary strategy. So all the policy is in place. Now, in terms of the officers themselves, Norfolk Constabulary at the moment, Paul, correct me if I've got these figures wrong, is 30% female, and our recruit intakes are approaching 50% female. So we have a much higher proportion of female officers than some services do, and they are backed up by quite a large proportion of both female civilian staff, where civilian staff are employed working with victims of crime, and also civilian volunteers. And then there's the broader piece of the charity sector, which also provides a lot of the victim support. So given what I know has been put in place, given the attitude I know exists in the constabulary, I think from an organizational perspective, from a management's perspective, we are very much aware of it, and I would suggest that we are on top of it in Norfolk. Now, I'll caveat that because the constabulary are recruited from the public, and it's society that's broken. And so it should not surprise anyone that we are recruiting officers from a broken society who import society's broken attitudes. So I cannot promise you that of the 1,800 officers and 1,300 police staff, every one of their WhatsApp accounts or Facebook accounts or whatever is completely clean, because I dare say there are things on some of those that we have not identified. We can vet officers before they arrive. That tells us what they might have done, but it won't tell us what they're going to do. We can train officers, and that tells them what they should do, but doesn't always tell them what they must do. But what I would come back to sort of round off is to say that, refer back to the Chief Constable's opening remarks. He gets the point that our whole relationship with women in particular, and women in Norfolk are 52% of our population, is really important. And where he spots things going wrong, he will root it out and deal with it. And I know, sitting where I sit, that he impresses on his officers that it's not just the Chief Constable in his office doing that. Every single officer, right down to the most newly arrived, most junior, has the responsibility to call out inappropriate behaviour. And I think at that point I better stop and let the Chief Constable come in and speak for his own force.
Thank you, Giles, and Val. Thank you for the question. So Giles is right about the percentages in the workforce. So currently, about 30% of our officers are female. We're not quite at 50% with new recruits at the moment, but we're getting ever closer to it. Of note, though, in police staff positions, we employ more women than we do men. So when you add together officers and staff, we're pretty even in terms of gender representation within the Constabulary and improving all of the time. Val, you mentioned the volumes of crime involving domestic abuse, child sexual abuse, sexual offences, and you're right, they aggregate together to present a colossal amount of crime. And the trouble with crime statistics when it comes to things such as domestic abuse and sexual offences is, of course, that's just what's reported to us. We know that this sort of crime is terribly underreported. And I think there's a real debate going on in policing as to, is there more domestic abuse, rape and sexual offences at the moment in this society? Or is it just the case that more is being reported? And I'm not sure I know the answer to that one yet. What I would say of when it comes to child sexual abuse, we know that roughly 40% of that which is reported to us happened at least a year before the report, and sometimes many, many years before the report. So all of those variables need to be understood when we look at offending levels. But yes, there is a lot going on. Of course, the police's responsibility is to identify and solve that crime. Prevention of those crimes is a wider societal responsibility. And I think that starts with young people understanding what a healthy relationship looks like. And there's only so much that the police service can do in informing that picture. We regularly, and myself included, regularly review these awful crimes. And you do have to wonder what on earth causes people to behave in this way. Of course, we're ready to react when the crime occurs, but we've got to have a broader look as to why this is taking place. RDA stats, it's not all female victims, actually. There's a significant proportion of male victims within there, but undeniably women are the majority in the numbers, but there's a good quantum of men within the figures. But at the heart of your question, Val, was, so what are we doing about it as a service? I could speak all night about this, so I'll try and just pick out a few points. I have channeled 85% of all of my detective activity into the investigation of sexual offences and serious domestic abuse. That's been a complete workload shift for my detectives. These are people who are predominantly investigating criminality such as fraud, such as robbery, such as aggravated burglaries. 85% of their time now is spent investigating rape and serious sexual offences. You'll see in the county that there have been recently 2 new police stations built, one at Swaffham, one at Broadland Gate. They are locations where we're pooling those detective resources together, providing them with the kit and equipment that they need to investigate this sort of crime. What do I mean by kit and equipment? Well, the sort of thing that means that if we have to take a victim's mobile phone off them, we're able to download that, take the evidence from it and return the phone to the victim in less than 24 hours. So that they can start the process of getting on with their lives. We've invested in what we call ABE suites. They are the appropriate buildings where we take victims of this sort of awful criminality to make sure that they receive the right care and forensic recovery from the police. I've created a small team of police officers which we put under the title of Operation Engage. Those officers' sole role is to work with victims to support them through the court process, to help them provide evidence, recognising the very traumatic nature of offending. I've also created another team who predominantly focus on DA perpetrators. So those people who jump from relationship to relationship, causing havoc wherever they go, we are proactively targeting them and making their life uncomfortable until they stop their offending. And finally, in the public space, we immediately after the death of Sarah Everard, we launched a campaign called Street Safe. Street Safe is an initiative where you can, if you just Google Street Safe, it pops up a map of the country. You can record on that map anywhere where you do not feel safe. We have promoted that heavily across Norfolk. And when on our map, locations are identified where people don't feel safe, we will go out and patrol them, and we have done that. We also ask on Street Safe, why don't you feel safe in that area? And often the answer is because there's no street lighting, or because it's run down, or there's graffiti. And when that happens, we are speaking with local authorities to try and improve the environment, to try and make people feel safer in the area where they live or work. And then finally, about the behaviours of police officers. Well, in many respects, I think I touched upon this earlier. I am proud to work alongside the overwhelming majority of police officers. They come to work every day because they want to make their communities safer, but they have been let down by some of their colleagues. And I repeat what I said earlier about, I don't want them in policing. I'm doing my best to root them out. And it is quite likely to be the case that you'll see more bad news before you see good news. But that bad news will be, well, I've caught another one, and I'm proactively looking for them. With my chief constable counterparts in the Eastern region, we've banded together some of our resources to create a regional team that are inspecting each other and carrying out, we call it anti-corruption activity, to find those corrupt officers that don't have any place in policing. So we've put more resource in that area as well. And to reiterate, all I'd say is when you see in the EDP, maybe in a couple of months' time, that another one has gone, it will be because I've found them. It will be because I've rooted them out, and I don't want them in the service.
Thanks for that, Paul. I think the truth of the matter is that the start of the process will result in more publicity, actually, about the types of officers you wouldn't be proud to work alongside, and that you want to see the back of, and that hopefully over time, if your efforts are successful, that should start to decrease, and people can have more confidence in the. I think
that's very accurate. And if I may, you've only got to look at the papers in the past few weeks. There's been similar headlines about the London Fire Brigade. We've seen similar headings about the military. We've been heard suggestions that the same behaviour exists in hospitals, in the BBC even. But of course, policing is held to a higher standard, and rightly so, because we're the ones that should be enforcing the laws. But to Giles's point earlier, there is a societal problem here, and we recruit from that society. We will set our entry standards as high as we possibly can, but some people will slip the net. And I would just ask to be judged on how I respond when they do slip the net, and how quickly I get them back out. And that's what we're determined to do.
And thank you. Can I just say something?
Yeah.
Thank you for your answers. I feel that there was a lot of blue washing going on there in those answers. And you can refer to bad apples and its societal problem. We know that, but your job is to recruit, and in your recruitment, do the level of vetting that is needed to make sure that you don't take these offenders on. And when you do find out, that you actually boot them out. You don't let them retire early, you boot them out. And so I, for one, and I know lots of other women, will be delighted to see headlines saying, Paul, you've kicked another 1, 2, 5 out. I did an FOI about this time last year, asking about the number of officers that have had disciplinary action taken. And I was staggered at by the extent to which the answer was trying to hide, but also the number of people that are basically breaking the law within the ranks of the police force. And whilst this continues, women in this country are not served well. We know that there are 2 women a week die in this country at the hands of men, either by rape and well, rape, and it's usually a combination of domestic violence, rape, and then murder. And it's not just Sarah Everard that's been was abducted, tortured, and raped by a police officer. There's many women that have been. So I think it's a widespread problem, and when I get angry, I guess I get less coherent, and I'm really angry at what's going on for women in this country at the hands of criminals that aren't being prosecuted. If they are prosecuted, they're not being convicted. And if they are convicted, they're let out and released to commit further crimes against women. So I want to work with the police. This is my county. It's where I live. I want to work with the police to, in a useful way, to help solve this problem. But you need to know that I'm going to be watching, because there are many of us that do not feel so at this point, who do not yet feel well served.
Well, if you don't mind, if I come back to that.
Sure.
I have not let a single officer retire from the Constabulary whilst I've been chief, when I would have had the powers to dismiss them.
That's great to know. That's
and all I can say in that regard is judge me on my record. Now, of course, the very nature of policing, just relevant to the FOI request you mentioned, the very nature of policing is officers do have a number of allegations made against them. Some of them true, some of them not true, frankly. And we do have to investigate them with fairness and impartiality, and be certain that when we do take action, that it's either, if it's a criminal case, at the criminal threshold, and that the evidence that we require to gather is there, and also when it comes to misconduct cases as well. And of course, what subsequently happens to them, as you touched upon, Val, about them, sanctions either being low or being kicked back out. Well, of course, that's absolutely beyond my control. But I can assure you, I share your frustration quite often at the level of penalties that some of these individuals receive. In my mind, it would often be advantageous if the deterrent was much higher than it is. I don't intend to blue wash. I don't intend to try and sugarcoat over it. I know that there's a significant concern amongst many people as to the scale and extent of domestic abuse. I don't wish to sound defensive about it. In many respects, I hope the impression I give is that I want to be on the attack about it, because I want to do something around it. But if I do have one frustration, it's that the police service is just but one player in this. It needs to be a complete criminal justice response. Mm-hmm. It needs to be a societal response. And at some point in time, we've got to start to ask the question as to why are young men behaving in this way? And I'm not sure that the police service alone has got the answer to that question.
I agree.
No, I think that's very true. That's very true. Anyway, Val, you need to keep on the case and make sure Paul stays on the case, I think. Right, have we got any questions from anybody else here? Right, Sarah, I saw your hand go up very quickly there, so if you can unmute and ask your question.
It's something like, obviously, with parish and town councils at the moment, where everybody's looking at ways that they can cost save and everything else. You just highlighted on a point that I think, as Val said, that she didn't feel safe in areas because of non-street lights, or could be non-street lights. But I know that a lot of parishes are thinking about turning their street lights off between 12 and 5. But we're being told that obviously that doesn't result in any more crimes or anything else. As a matter of fact, if you see someone with a torch, you're more likely to check than anybody else. So I don't know whether you want to comment on that. Obviously, you've both said about, obviously, there are cost of living crisis is on the force, and obviously wage increases, because obviously police officers have their cost of living problems as well. is there any other things that are going to affect the cost of living? And obviously you're looking at budgets, and obviously are there any budgets that are going to be cut, and how will this affect the people of Norfolk?
Right, you've got just 20 minutes on that, Giles.
Oh, thank you. I'll try and keep this sort of fairly short, actually. As I alluded to in my introductory remarks, there are huge pressures on police budgets. I mean, everything that an individual household suffers from, so the constabulary suffers. In the budgetary exercise for next year, we're looking at about £2 million for oil and gas to heat premises, which is up about 500,000 on this year. We're looking at about 1.6 million to put fuel into police vehicles. That's up about 400,000, but that 400,000 doesn't include the, I think it's 12p a litre fuel duty that the Chancellor imposed in his autumn statement, and I haven't done the maths on what that means. Everything is going up. I mean, simple things like we have, as a public sector organisation, we have to have our accounts audited against public standards by a commercial company. Their fees have just gone up 150%. So everything is going up in policing. Meanwhile, the public still expects a service. So what Paul and I are working on very carefully is how we can make the money we have stretch further to deliver the same level of service effectively for less, because it's been eroded by inflation. The budget for next year was set by the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, when he stood at the dispatch box as Chancellor on the 27th of October last year. And if you think of all the changes of Prime Minister and other personalities we've had since then, that sounds an extraordinary long time ago. But he set the figures for the comprehensive spending review. We're in year one now. We're just about to go into year two. That is the budget that we're discussing. At the time that budget was set, inflation was assumed to be 2%, but had just spiked at 3.4% and was thought to be a short-term spike. And we all know that inflation is now north of 10%, a lot of it driven by the situation in Ukraine and our relationship breakdown with Russia and all that goes with that. And therefore, one wonders when inflation will drop back from 10%, and I don't sense it's going to be any time soon. But the government has got a nightmare of a task trying to balance the books. And at the moment, policing and the criminal justice system is not top of the financial pops. The important thing is we're not being cut. And I think what the new Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, said when he stood at the dispatch box, and I forget exactly when it was, about the 12th of November, I think, he did say that some departments of state would have to absorb budget cuts. I'm not sure if the Home Office has had to absorb a budget cut, and police funding comes through the Home Office, that element that's provided by the Treasury. So our working assumption is the 55% of Norfolk Constabulary's budget that comes from the Treasury through the Home Office will broadly be as forecast last year. But yes, we will have to take the hit for inflation, for pay inflation, and all the other increased costs. I am not allowed, and I hold the police budget, I'm not allowed by law to run a budget in the red. I have to balance the budget. So what we've been looking at is how we can do things better, smarter, and so on, without cutting the service the public gets. And I'm nervous. I think we can just about do it for year two, which is the coming financial year, but I'm very nervous about year three unless the government puts more money into policing and criminal justice. And that's something we will have to look at. Part of that factor is the precept, balanced against the cost of living spike and people's ability to pay. What I'm currently looking at is a £10 increase. That works out as £9.99 for the year on a Band D property, or £7.77 on a Band B property. That's roughly 19p a week or 15p a week for those respective properties. And I'm hopeful that that will be judged by Norfolk to be affordable. I'm required to do a consultation, and clearly as an elected representative of the public who speaks on the public's behalf, I need to know what the public's view is. But in statutes, if you distill all my functions down to one line, it is to ensure that Norfolk has an efficient and effective police force. So, you know, I do face a difficult decision in that I've got to balance all the factors of cost of living with the fact that crime is likely to rise in a cost of living crisis, and I still need to deliver, as my ultimate bottom line, an efficient, effective police force.
Okay, thanks.
I'm not sure I've really answered your question, Sarah, but come back and ask me to fill in the bits I haven't answered if you want me to. Yeah.
Paul, I don't know if you want to add anything, and particularly on the issue that Sarah raised at the beginning, like the possible impact of cost-cutting measures by parish and town councils, which I have to say, I know from my own experience can sometimes be counterintuitive, that actually some things that you think will make things worse, paradoxically, you know, can actually make things slightly better because of changes in people's behaviour.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, we all face difficult decisions, don't we? Whether it be in our parishes or myself as Chief Constable. The start of the question just covered street lighting, and if I might just offer a comment on that. And a number of years ago, the County Council undertook a big consultation on the turning off of police lights, of street lights. And part of their assessment involved the review of police crime data to understand what the impact of turning off the lights was on crime figures. And actually there was negligible impact, but there's a but. And the but is that fear of crime is almost as bad as being a victim of crime. But it's much harder to quantify. And I've often seen the result of that assessment being misrepresented as a view from the police service that there is no impact of turning off lights. And I think that fear of crime piece is very important. So I appreciate that tough decisions such as that will have to be made. Yeah, please consider fear of crime as much as the impact on actual crime. When it comes to funding cuts, it's quite a tricky question to answer. It really does depend on the theme. What I would say is this: if we look at education, for example, the more children that we keep in schools and aren't excluded from education, the lower the demands on policing. If special schools for children who find themselves in bother see a reduction in their funding, then you know that those behavioural challenges will be passed on to the police. Were we to see in areas such as social care, where the threshold for support from social workers gets higher, the likelihood is that the behaviours of children that start as poor behaviour might end up in criminal behaviour, again increasing the load upon policing. And I've spoken earlier around mental health, albeit I think mental health isn't so much about funding, it's about the adequacy of staffing and finding staff to work in that department that is the challenge. But again, another example of where funding challenges or resource challenges are creating a strain on policing. And look, I could go on, I could reference the same around the ambulance, same about around hospitals. We are entering a challenging time. But do I think the Constabulary can weather the storm? Yes, I do. We can weather the storm if we are able to maintain at least a reasonable level of funding. No matter what money is allocated to me, I will never be able to address every demand that comes my way. I rarely attend one of these meetings and do not have an area of policing identified where a member of the public would wish us to do more, and I accept that. But we've been really sensible and careful with our financial planning. We've worked very closely with the Commissioner's office to make sure that we are balancing the books, but maintaining a sensible level of service. And we're going to do everything that we can to maintain that, no matter what the challenges are ahead of us.
Okay, thank you for that. Well, we've got a couple of questions / observations in the chat. Cynthia from Hunstanton says that at Hunstanton Town Council, where they receive reports about criminal behaviour, and a lot of the time the domestic or family abuse situations, the victim frequently doesn't want to take the matter any further. She mentions that must be frustrating and a feeling of waste of time. And then Val mentions about domestic violence refugees finding the issues that women who do eventually end up leaving violent situations. It often takes several incidents, shall we say, before they can take the decision to actually uproot them. I think this begins to touch on issues around the links, and perhaps you could talk a little bit more about the links between the police and some of the other support services, whether that be social services, and in the first instance, the links you might have with the CPS, where you can make sure that I suppose the efficiency of the investigations is as great as it can possibly be. So you lead to an outcome where there is some actual positive action rather than lots of activity without any end point.
Will I lead
Yeah.
on that, or
I'm happy for you to, Giles, and then I'll come in afterwards.
okay? Then you come in. I mean, on Cynthia's point, I speak as chair of the Norfolk and Suffolk Local Criminal Justice Board, and she does touch on an important point. It goes back to the comment I was making about offences being reported but not prosecuted. And yes, if the constabulary attend an incident and clearly something's gone on, but there's nothing to see now, it's very difficult to pursue that incident if the victim, and let's face it, if you're in a relationship, quite often, no matter how strange it might seem, the victim might still love the abuser. And you've got that loyalty that means that they won't pursue it. Now, the constabulary, and the chief might want to say more about this, you know, if appropriate, will be wearing body-worn camera and are prepared to pursue incidents, even if the victim doesn't want to pursue. But I'll let him talk more about that. The greater concern from my perspective is actually where you do have victims who want to pursue. And I go back to my opening remarks and the state of the criminal justice system and the problem we have when it takes so long to get to court, because you've got somebody who might have moved on from that particular issue, who then has to revisit that issue as they prepare for court, is then hauled over the coals by the defense lawyers. And for a lot of people, they get to the point where they've stopped being upset by what's happened, they've stopped being angry about what's happened, they've basically got over what's happened, and actually they want to get on with their lives, not keep revisiting it because there's a prospective court case coming up. And so we lose quite a lot of prosecutions because victims withdraw from the case. And where the victim is the key witness, as they usually are, it's very difficult then for the Crown prosecution to pursue the perpetrator, and that becomes difficult. On the second question, yes, I fully understand that a lot of victims take a long time before they come forward. I've heard figures significantly higher than 7+ reports before the victim departs. Here, we're moving into the support that has to be provided by agencies beyond the constabulary, because we're back into the societal problem here. But I would flag up the work that's being done by NIDAS, the Norfolk Integrated Domestic Abuse Service, which was a service launched in January of this year at the behest of my office, largely funded by my office, but is a partnership of predominantly of the charity sector, supported by 5 of the district councils, 5 of the 7 district councils, and Norfolk County Council. So bringing all of those together. So part of what we're doing now is to make life easier for people who want to move. So if, for example, you've got a victim in Great Yarmouth who wants to leave the home, they may have already sought support, they may be on the books, they may be getting counselling, they may be getting legal help, etc., etc. But before NIDAS was created, if they then moved to Norwich, let's say, they would fall off the radar because they'd left Great Yarmouth. The whole concept of NIDAS is that it's an integrated county-wide service, and they remain very firmly on the radar. They don't have to fill in lots more paperwork. All they do is to have to give their change of address. They might even get the same counsellor moving from Yarmouth down to Norwich to provide that support. NIDAS is a great service led by Leeway, who are very experienced in this field, in the charity sector, supported by a number of the domestic violence and other similar charities from across the county, and is steadily expanding. And this is where wider society needs to lean in and help the Constabulary, because the Constabulary can respond to the individual instance, but they can't do everything. They can't support victims outside those individual instances. And this is where charities like Leeway, coordinated programs like NIDAS, can really add support and help and look after victims. In the short term, that helps us keep them on side so we can get the perpetrators brought to book in court. And obviously that stops them going on to another family and causing mayhem there, as the Chief alluded to earlier. But in the longer term, it helps them to get back into normal lives. And one group that we haven't really mentioned in this is children. Children learn behaviours at their parents' knees, and we need to break the cycle of this behaviour. So we don't need children to learn this behaviour, regarded as normal, and carry it forward into the next generation, where Paul and my successors and all of our successors will then have to be dealing with it at that point. Paul, you probably want to come in at that point.
Well, Giles, I think you've covered most of it. It's just to the very first question, if I may, there was I think the question touched upon the number of victims that don't support prosecution. The only additional thing I'd say about that is, our starting objective when we go to any domestic abuse incident is to make the abuse stop. That's priority number one. Priority number two is then to achieve a criminal justice outcome if that's the right thing to do. And sometimes I don't think it's right that we judge the police's success on a conviction rate. Much of the domestic abuse that we investigate is at the minor end of the scale. Some of it would involve not just the traditional abuse of husband on wife or male on female, but sometimes it can involve child on mother or child on dad or sibling abuse as well. So it's quite a broad category of offending. And actually in those circumstances, mum might not want the son prosecuted, and that might not be the right thing to take place for that child. So sometimes the discontinuance or the decision not to support is the right thing and in the best interest of the victim. But equally, as Giles set out, when we believe that it isn't, we will try and capture the evidence and present it to the Crown Prosecution Service, even without the victim's consent, because we identify that sometimes it's in the victim's best interest for us to carry on regardless. So we just have to assess each case on its merits. I touched upon a new team that I've set up under the banner of Operation Engage. They are working with victims of the highest risk domestic abuse, rape and sexual offences to support them with giving evidence. And then just to the point around the CPS, Giles, I think, has covered that. We are frustrated by the amount of time it's taking cases to get through court. It's really proving difficult for victims. It's not good for confidence in the justice system. It's not good for victim, perpetrator or witness. And it also means, in terms of my officer's workloads, that we are maintaining our contact with victims for a longer period. Now, of course, we want to support until that support is no longer required. But that does stop those officers from being able to have the capacity to move on to the next case. So it does create a challenge for us. But Chair, I think Giles covered everything else in the question.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, I'm very conscious of time, so if anybody's got a very quick last question for either Giles or Paul. Judy, you've got your hand up. Do you want to unmute and just ask something quickly?
It's not really a question, it's a comment. Just for lower level crime, we had an issue in Sproston with antisocial behaviour. And I like to say that the local neighbourhood team did react and did support the town council, and we were very happy with their support.
Excellent. Well, that's a nice note to finish on for,
Yeah, thank you, Judy.
for both of you.
Thank you, Judy. Yeah, absolutely.
Right. I would say, so as I said, time's moving on now. We're very close to the end of the meeting. One of the things I would say to all of you, or indeed to anybody else you're in contact with, if you have any questions for Giles or Paul, if you feed them either through me or through Sarah here at Norfolk ALC, we will pass them on, and I'm sure Giles and Paul will be able to answer those in the fullness of time. And the other thing is that of course, as Giles mentioned in his initial talk, there is the consultation on the budget. When the proposals are firmed up, then I'm sure Giles will be interested in receiving people's views and response on it. And if there is any appetite for it, of course, we can arrange to have another webinar of this type to open it up for a more general discussion. But that's perhaps something for the new year. So I would like to thank, on behalf of all of you, Giles and Paul, for giving up their time this evening and being available to talk to you and deal with some quite complex and complicated issues. And thank you to you all for making the time to come along and put your questions to them and to take part. And as I said, this has been recorded, so if anybody you know of would like to have taken part and hasn't been able to, then it will be available via our YouTube channel. And I look forward to seeing you all again in the future, and enjoy the rest of your evenings. And indeed, if I don't see you beforehand, have a very good Christmas. Thank you and good night.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks very much.
Thank you.